This is part two of the oral exam for the final exam of wildlife policy. I've had a really good time this semester, and I hope I hadn't been hope I hadn't been chatting your ear off too much. But let's go ahead and get started with this. So the first part of this exam was based on the letter that we wrote. So I wrote my letter to Barry Loudermilk, which is actually my district's representative in Georgia, in the House of Representatives, and I wrote him basically to tell him that the people he represents have way stronger environmental opinions than what he thought that they did. But his stance on the Endangered Species Act to begin with, he consistently supports economic growth and prioritizes like development and the economy. So by nature, that kind of means that anything to do with environmental protections that inhibits that, he's kind of against. He's a Republican from Georgia, so I mean that's hate to say it's a given, but it is a little bit. His website actually does not list any ecological viewpoints at all. It doesn't list anything about the environment or his stances on that. However, economic growth is like the first thing that's listed on his priority list on his website. So that's straight from his mouth. Other environmental legislation outside of the Endangered Species Act, I checked the League of Conservation Voters, which is basically like a little tally of like environmental legislation and policy that's been voted on for each representative, and he has a score of a lifetime of 1%, which is incredible. But he has pretty much consistently voted against environmental policy constantly, just because, again, it is a little bit of a hindrance to the economic development. Economic development in Georgia is no shortage of. It is ruining the state, but that's besides the point. So I wrote him to try and change that. The one environmental issue he actually did vote for is releasing management of American bison to tribal governments, which would therefore release them from the American government. So I feel like that's pretty obvious. So my letter. I tried to take a stance that he would appreciate. He's an Air Force veteran, so I tried to come from the stance of national security and write him about how the amendments to the Endangered Species Act open up a lot of potential for economic overconsumption of our natural resources. And my overall goal with this was just to maybe, hopefully, change his viewpoint and try to like restructure the way he thinks about voting on environmental issues, and ultimately get him to vote to keep the Endangered Species Act as it is right now, which is, in my opinion, the way it should be. We'll get into that. So, next, changing the Endangered Species Act. I keep wanting to say Environmental Species Act. That's not what it is. It's Endangered Species Act. I hate it. I don't like it. So the executive order, Unleashing America's Energy, that basically has opened up a huge can of worms in all of the land management agencies to basically be at war with our economy, trying to protect our land. One specific example of that is secretarial order from the Department of the Interior Secretary that is, again, to restructure the Endangered Species Act, and I don't like it. What it does is it inserts the value of economics into critical habitat listings. Economics is valuable. Every American needs the economy to be strong and stable, but for that to be a large factor in a biological opinion for whether or not a tract of land is critical habitat, that has nothing to do whether or not the tract of land is critical habitat, quite frankly. It also forces the Fish and Wildlife Service right here to compromise on decisions with we have to kind of like people who we make contracts with and we make policy, we interact through policy with, we have to compromise with them on how we're protecting and what we're protecting, and that's not, we don't really like to play ball like that. Like we have the Endangered Species Act for a reason, and that's just the way it is. So we're not really digging the projected amendments. And ultimately, it just reduces the effectiveness of laws and court rulings. So, some of the listed stuff in the amendments was to revert back to pre-court ruling on some pretty important cases. And apparently, those cases mean nothing because we're just going to go back and undo them. So, that is changing the Endangered Species Act. I don't like it. Shocker. Um, Politics and climate change. So, what's the down low? Let's get into it. So the United States has a long-standing history with climate change. I mean, for what it's worth, the United States is in the front runnings of environmental and conservation research. So we kind of do put up a lot of money towards that, as much as we also devalue it in a way. But in previous decades, especially way early on, America's response to climate change and just conservation in general was generally very positive. In the beginning, we had pretty strict rules. The Clean Air Act, it was in 1963. I mean, that was shoot decades ago. And it established some pretty like core fundamental no-goes, which I think, and I mean, we have NEPA. NEPA was 1970, which is again core environmental legislation that has paved the way for all of the stuff we do now. Um, we've gone downhill ever since. So the United States now, especially in this decade being the 2020s, uh, we've had some ups and downs. So the current administration is very adamant about pursuing economic policies. It is very money driven, which unfortunate is it's not good for the environment per se. But so one positive out of the 2020s so far is in 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed, and that gave a ton of funding to land management agencies. I mean, I can speak for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service personally. We've had a ton of bill projects. I mean, the Southeast region has just done leaps and bounds with that money, and it's been awesome. Um, the Inflation Reduction Act has aimed to help people, the American people at large, in their wallets, which makes it easier to vote towards environmental policies when you're not struggling and being promised better economic, you know, here you go, you can have economics, you can have the environment, you get to choose. So it makes it easier to vote for the environment when you're not worried about whether or not you're going to starve. Um, and then the current amendments, obviously, what we're talking about right now to the Endangered Species Act, that we're taking a turn for the worse. We started off strong in the 2020s. We're coming back. So we've had our ups and downs this decade, but that's where we stand. Other nations also have their ups and downs. Depends really on the nation. Well, it varies. It varies absolutely 110%. So Denmark, Norway, Finland, they have some super, super strict environmental regulations and policies, and they absolutely stick to them. So hats off to them. They're always in the top. Bhutan is CO2 negative, one of two countries in the world that is actually CO2 negative. Um, and then obviously we have our big producers. China and India are our largest contributors to climate change. And, they're not 100% known for their environmental actions. So it just depends on the nation and non-governmental organizations. So NGOs, I would be willing to bet we'd be a lot worse off without NGOs. I will say that. Our government, specifically the United States, we are extremely wealthy all around as a government, and the NGOs really pick up the slack. Even though we could pick up the slack if we wanted to, but we don't, and they do. So the Nature Conservancy, we work with them a ton here in Georgia, at least. They're just stellar, stellar program. The Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, all sorts of places. They do a good job. And overall, we have our work cut out for us. We have to keep writing our legislators. You've taught me how to do that in this class, so I'm going to keep doing that because I'll talk to anybody. Keep protecting wildlife. That's what we do. That's why we're here. And just keep fighting the good fight. Just keep pushing forward. Do what we can with what we got. And if we don't like it, it'll change in 4 years, and that'll be okay. So here are my sources, and thank you again for a wonderful semester. I thoroughly enjoyed this class and appreciate it. So bye.